Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Zoe, a member of the ICCT communications team. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded. Everyone has their microphones on mute. If you have any questions, you can write them in the questions block in the control panel to the right of your screen. After the presentation, we will have some additional time to answer questions from the audience. Today, we are going to talk about aligning aviation with the Paris Agreement, What's Possible, presented by Dan Rutherford. Dan directs ICCT's Aviation and Marine Programs and is a 15-year veteran of the organization. He is an internationally recognized expert on measures to promote the fuel efficiency of international transport, to control short-lived climate pollutants, and to phase out the use of fossil fuels. Dan has helped design environmental policies at the UN's International Civil Aviation Organization and International Maritime Organization for over a decade. Dan holds a PhD in environmental engineering and science from Stanford University. Thank you for leading this today, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Zoe, and thanks everyone for joining today. So very pleased to be presenting this new report that my aviation colleagues and I released early in June. I think it's very much front and center today, what sorts of measures will be needed to decarbonize global aviation, and I hope that this is a useful input into that discussion. Next slide, please. If you could skip back. So this is the outline of my presentation today, pretty typical. I'll start out with some general policy background for you. We'll then talk about how we designed the study and what questions we were aiming to answer. I'll then walk you through the results and our assessment of what is achievable in terms of bringing aviation in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. I'll close with some conclusions and policy implications, and then we will have questions and discussion. Next slide. Next slide. Moving to the background. If you've dialed into this webinar, you are already aware that aviation has a serious fossil fuel problem. Globally, airlines emit on the order of 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. And those emissions are overwhelmingly dominated by fossil fuels. Currently, there are very minimal amounts of alternative fuel penetration in aviation, and 99.95% of energy use is from fossil fuels. What that means is if you get on a typical long-haul flight, the airline may be loading on the order of twice your mass in fuel in order to get you to your destination. And this is just a graphic that I picked up from social media, kind of an extreme case, but a fellow who was living in the UK returned to his native country, New Zealand, and did his calculation that along with him, about 4 barrels of jet fuel made the trip. Next slide. This question of how to control aviation emissions has been with us for quite a while. Back in 1997, in the Kyoto Protocol, the regulation of emissions in international airspace and international waters was, in essence, delegated from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to its sister agencies, the International Maritime Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization. And to be blunt, there was not much action for several decades. And this is a picture actually from the COP21 meeting in 2015, in which marine and aviation were highlighted as the problem children, in essence, and the elephants in the room that were not being properly regulated. Next slide. If you could go back. Now, at the ICCT, I have the luck, or maybe the misfortune, of doing 2 of the trickier modes. I work both on international maritime shipping and aviation. And we did see shipping move ahead in 2018. At the IMO, there was an agreement for an initial greenhouse gas strategy that year, which codified a target to, among other things, reduce shipping emissions by 50% in 2050 below 2008 levels. At the same time, there's been significant action to put in place mandatory measures to support that goal, ranging from new technical efficiency standards for ships, operational efficiency measures to reduce the carbon intensity in use, and increasingly discussion about carbon pricing and low greenhouse gas fuel standards. So IMO very much took the lead in 2018. There was a lot of activism that drove this around the theme of IMO, please don't sink Paris. Next slide. The good news now is that the aviation sector is moving to catch up. There's been a great deal of momentum built over the past year to lock in a Paris moment for aviation in Montreal this fall. Montreal is where the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, is based. And starting in February of last year, we've seen a drumbeat of net zero targets and net zero roadmaps being announced by industry and government. And agreeing to a 2050 climate goal this fall in Montreal would be really important. It's a key way to unlock new investments in clean planes and clean fuels that will be fundamentally driven at the national level. That's the good news. There are some risks, both to potentially not getting an agreement this fall, and also potentially getting an agreement that doesn't actually drive the investments that we need. So some member states are still raising questions about the feasibility of meeting net zero emission targets in 2050. There is always a danger that we agree to a zero target in 2050, and then because there are no interim targets towards that, emissions climb and climb and climb and climb on the theory that we can dramatically reduce them in, for example, the decade from 2040 on. So that is a risk as well. Finally, fundamentally, ICAO is going to agree to an aspirational global target. And there is a risk that that's as far as it goes for some time, and we don't get actually concrete measures out of this. With these three risks in mind, we released our Vision 2050 roadmap last month, and I'm happy to walk you through that today. Next slide. So on to study design. So we took a first pass at this question back in September of 2020 in our first Vision 2050 document. That was a very broad assessment that looked at all modes of transport and all the major markets in the world, with the goal of identifying what is needed to decarbonize transport writ large by mid-century. In that first pass, we estimated that global aviation carbon dioxide could be cut to about 300 million tons in 2050 through aircraft technology improvements and clean fuels. To put that into perspective, in 2019, pre-COVID, commercial airlines emitted about 920 million tons. So we're talking about cutting overall CO2 by about 2/3 in 2050. That was our first pass. In this new report, we've revisited the question, and we've gone a little bit further. The new report takes into account new technologies that are gaining increasing interest, including potential hydrogen use in aviation. We also dug down a little bit further in operational measures, including the most aggressive potential strategies like formation flying, and looked into strategies like modal shift from aviation to high-speed rail. For this project, we developed a new model, the Projection of Aviation Carbon Emissions Model, or PACE model, that is a partially integrated model, which allows us to estimate the fuel costs and resulting demand response as a function of the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels. In essence, we are able to ballpark what impact these clean fuels would have on ticket prices and then consumer demand over time. And finally, in this new report, we do a fairly detailed comparison of the results to other roadmaps that have been released over the past year from industry and from governments. Next slide. So this is our core research question. To what extent can various measures reduce cumulative carbon dioxide emissions from global aviation in line with 1.5, 1.75, and 2 degree Celsius targets? Those of you who are familiar with UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement will see that 1.5 is cited as the most aggressive target under Paris. 1.75 is considered the well below 2 degree pathway, and 2 degrees Celsius is the minimum level of emission in Paris. So we're sort of bounding the range of ambition in that agreement. Next slide. So in the report, which is available on our website, we developed 3 scenarios for future adoption of low carbon technologies in aviation. There's the action scenario, the transformation scenario, and the breakthrough scenario. And our assumptions increase in ambition as you move from S1 to S2 to S3. There's also a reference scenario, a business as usual scenario that's numbered S0. That's meant to, in essence, capture business as usual trends through 2050, both in traffic and technology uptake. Next slide. So we look at 6 main mitigation wedges in the report, and this slide just outlines those 6. Aircraft technology indicates the introduction of new aircraft types with lower fuel burn. Operations, I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, are in essence strategies that airlines and air traffic control agencies can use to reduce the fuel burn of aircraft when they are in service. Sustainable aviation fuels is a key lever. These are drop-in replacements for fossil jet fuel that can be synthesized either from biological feedstocks or from excess renewable energy. We also look at zero-emission planes. This is an umbrella term for new aircraft types fueled either by hydrogen or potentially electricity for the shortest routes that can get off liquid hydrocarbon fuels completely. We look at the economic incentives and the fuel price changes that would be needed to drive those first 4 technology wedges, and then translate that into a change in traffic. This is in essence the demand response from an increase in fuel and ticket pricing. If you go on our website, you'll see all of the gory detail on the assumptions that we used for each of these wedges in each of the scenarios. I'm actually going to gloss over that today just to conserve on time. Next slide. This is the flow of the PACE model itself. It's a little bit complicated, but we start with base traffic. We feed that traffic into a fleet turnover model. That's 2 here in the graphic. We segment that activity down to a 4x4 matrix of aircraft size and stage length. From there, we estimate the base energy efficiency of that fleet in terms of megajoules per revenue passenger kilometer, or RPKs. That fuel efficiency gets fed into a fuels module where we bring in the amount of sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, electricity, etc., and estimate emissions. From there, we feed the result into a demand response. In essence, this is the increase in fuel price and increase in ticket price that leads to a somewhat smaller traffic growth. And then we loop that back into the next analysis here. This is an iterative process. So you imagine starting at 1 in 2020, we run the model through and estimate the demand response and feed that back in as step 1 in 2021. And we run this on an annual basis up to 2050 for our 4 scenarios. Next slide. I wanted to highlight a couple of things that we do differently in our report than some of the other roadmaps. The first is our characterization of aviation fuel efficiency. Most of the roadmaps you see basically disaggregate this into 2 separate levers. One is aircraft fuel burn or technical efficiency. That again is the fuel burn improvements due to new aircraft types. And the other is a vaguer bucket, which is just operational efficiency. In ICCT's research, we've done quite a bit of work on this and have concluded that there are very material differences between, in essence, how well different airlines fill their planes. We define that as a new term in this study, that's payload efficiency. And we distinguish it from traffic efficiency, which is in essence, work by airlines and air traffic management agencies to fly the planes better and more efficiently. It's important to do this because we've actually found that in some markets and in some time spaces, this payload efficiency is driving the majority of the fuel burn gains. For example, in the United States, from 2005 to 2019, we estimate that 2/3 of all airline fuel efficiency gains were coming from payload efficiency rather than from new aircraft types or from traffic management. So this is something we wanted to highlight in the report, and I hope it's useful to other researchers in the future. Next slide. The other thing that we did a little bit different was how we estimated the fuel cost increase due to SAFs. One of the big mysteries when you look at a lot of roadmaps is to figure out how the economics work in the midterm. Everyone agrees that sustainable aviation fuels today are too expensive. Typically, you hear 2 to 5 times the cost of fossil jet fuel. There is a potential to scale fuels over time and reduce them down the cost curve. But most roadmaps are really fuzzy on how the economics work in the midterm. So the approach that we've took is to model a fuel price increase in 2 different ways. Up until about 2040, we model the cost of SAFs in essence as a cross subsidy, where you charge for the carbon on fossil jet fuel, recycle that revenue to support a more limited number of SAF projects and SAF introductions. In essence, you're using a lever to charge, for example, the 95% fuel in the system that's fossil jet fuel to generate revenue to support the 5% of SAFs. That's up until about 2040 in our modeling. From 2040 on, we conclude that the SAFs have scaled sufficiently enough to come down the cost curve, and then the cost of SAFs and the cost of fuel are modeled as a classic abatement cost. For example, that you could bridge through a carbon tax or a fuel tax or an emissions trading system. This is an approach that is being taken in the EU right now to promote SAFs. We also see a form of this in California here, where I live, under the low carbon fuel standard. Next slide. So that's all the background. Let's jump into the results. And again, the full details are in the report on our website. I wanted to start with the jet fuel, the Jet A fuel share here. When we look at the 6 wedges I introduced, we conclude that the single largest contributor to emission reductions through 2050 are sustainable aviation fuels. This graphic shows the share of fossil jet fuel that we model across the 3 scenarios from 2020 to 2050. The baseline case, we assume no SAF, because as I mentioned, SAF uptake has remained negligible to date. In the action case, we see the fossil jet fuel share fall to about half in 2050. In the transformation case, we see it fall more than 3/4. And in the breakthrough case, we see fossil jet fuel demand on an absolute basis peak in 2025 and then fall to 0 by 2050. Next slide. Here you can see the absolute energy demand by fuel type, specifically for the breakthrough scenario. So this is the most aggressive scenario that we've modeled. The units are in exajoules. So if you multiply exajoules by 23, you'll in essence get the million tons of fuel in any given year. In 2019, we had about 12.5 exajoules of energy used in aviation, primary energy. We again see that peak in 2025 and then fall steadily afterwards in the breakthrough case. By 2050, we are seeing about 16 exajoules of total demand. In the breakthrough case, almost 80% of that is sustainable aviation fuels. We see about 22% of energy demand associated with liquid hydrogen. This number may grow past 2050 if these designs succeed, but because of the limitations of fleet turnover and the fact that these aircraft would not be introduced until 2035 or later, there is a limitation on how much of the overall fuel demand will be hydrogen in 2050. But within the SAFs, we see by 2050 about 2/3 of that coming from synthetic fuels. So that would be e-kerosene generated from renewable electricity, and about 4 exajoules, or about 1/3 of that, coming from advanced biofuels. Next slide. Now, I mentioned earlier that the PACE model can estimate the fuel cost increase associated with the introduction of sustainable aviation fuels. We're showing here our estimated weighted average fuel price in dollars per liter from 2020 through 2050. And you can see across the scenarios, again, action is red, transformation is yellow, and breakthrough is blue, a pretty significant increase in fuel prices. Jumping out to 2050, in most of the scenarios, we're seeing fuel prices increase by 60 to upwards of 70% from the baseline case. And this is due to the cost premium and the green premium for sustainable aviation fuels. Prices go highest for the breakthrough case because we have larger volumes of SAF, and also we are assuming greater use of direct air capture as a source for carbon, which comes with a cost premium. Next slide. I did want to draw your attention to the 2030 price number for the breakthrough case. This may be the most important sub-finding, I think, of our study. Under that case, we're estimating the fuel prices increase about 30% above baseline in 2030, which is a pretty significant volume. It speaks to the fact that SAFs will remain more expensive than fossil jet fuel for the foreseeable future. I think this number, in my mind, it introduces caution on my part on the expectation that voluntary targets are going to be effective in moving SAF markets. We know that airlines are very price sensitive. We know that they care deeply about fuel costs. So when you hear, for example, voluntary targets that an airline will adopt 10% SAF by 2030, I would be thinking about this 30% fuel price increase. Next slide. For those of you who are more familiar in thinking about this as carbon prices, we also present those in the report. So the flow here is SAF volumes to fuel prices to carbon prices. And you can see here, we see in essence a ramp up of carbon prices over time, up to between 2037 and 2050 across scenarios. And then for those scenarios where SAFs reach economies of scale, we actually see the implied carbon prices start to drop. And that's the inflection point where we go from the cross-subsidy approach to the pure marginal abatement cost approach. We're in essence scaling SAFs sufficiently that they come down the cost curve. But typically we see carbon prices on the order of $300 per ton across the scenarios. And looking again specifically at 2030, $15 to $80 per ton, depending upon the scenario. $80 per ton is actually a pretty reasonable price if you consider what is going on in the EU right now under its aviation regulation, but is a substantial stretch for the rest of the world. Next slide. Oh, sorry, that is my marker to the 2030 finding I just introduced. Next slide. So let's talk about demand response. I think one of the nicer things to see through this study is that we do expect that there will be a demand response and a reduction in traffic as a function of these price increases, but it is relatively modest. So once we take that upwards of 70% fuel price increase, we split it into tickets where it's more like a 22% ticket price increase, and then we feed it into demand elasticities. We find that the estimated traffic in 2050 drops by about 7% in the breakthrough case and about 2.5% on a cumulative basis. But that again is from the baseline. If you compare it to 2019 levels, we still do see substantial aviation traffic growth. So instead of traffic growing by 150% from 2019 to 2050, we see an increase more in the range of 130%. Next slide. I won't say too much about these graphics, but we do estimate both the energy intensity of the fleet and the carbon intensity of the fuels, and we present those independently in the report. Carbon intensity here in CO2 equivalent per megajoule is on the right. You see that dropping quite substantially in the breakthrough case because of in particular, because of all of the SAF introduction and also hydrogen introduction. Energy efficiency drops less. We still are largely talking about wing and tube designs, and those have engineering and design constraints. But in the breakthrough case, we are modeling a 45% reduction in the energy intensity of the fleet in 2050, and increasing ambition across the scenarios. There is a bit of a smaller gap between the transformation case and the breakthrough case on an energy efficiency basis, in part because we are introducing hydrogen designs, and those do have a small fuel efficiency penalty relevant to conventional fossil-fueled aircraft. Next slide. All right, we're going to jump into the key findings next. I am going to present our high-level results both on an absolute emissions basis, that's tons of CO2 in a year, and then a cumulative basis where we add up that CO2 over time through 2050. Just to note, all of the results I'll present to you now are on a well-to-wake basis. So this takes into account both emissions from burning the fuel, but emissions upstream from producing the fuel. We were not able to tackle the non-CO2 climate impacts in this first analysis. Those of you who study this know that these are really important. By some estimates, the climate impacts of nitrogen oxides, black carbon, water vapor, and especially contrails might be twice as much as CO2 alone. We know we have to tackle that. It was just too challenging of an analytical task this time around. When I relate our results to the Paris Agreement goals, I'll be using IPCC global climate budgets. We're assuming that we're aiming for a 67% probability of meeting those. And in each case, I'm pegging aviation's share of a global carbon budget at 2019 levels. So in 2019, airline fuel use was 2.4% of anthropogenic CO2, and the upstream fuel production was an additional 0.5%. So we're pegging that over time. Next slide. So here we can see the changes in the cumulative emissions from aviation over time as a function of these various scenarios. So you can see our baseline, action, transformation, breakthrough scenarios. The brown bars are the residual emissions. So these are the emissions that took place over the 3-decade period. The colored bars here are the mitigation. So these are the reductions in emissions as a function of efficiency gains and clean fuels. So you can see pretty substantial reductions in the cumulative emissions. Under the action case, we're cutting those by about 15 gigatons through 2050. Transformation case, it's about 20 gigatons. And in the breakthrough case, we are cutting the total emissions from aviation by more than half in 2050. The largest share comes from SAFs, as I mentioned. Typically about 60% of total mitigation comes from sustainable aviation fuels. Typically about 30% comes from fuel efficiency gains, and the balance coming from either zero emission planes or from the demand change that I've highlighted. The vertical dotted lines indicate the carbon budgets that are implied by the rules I just presented. So in the case of the action case, it in essence uses up a 2°C budget for aviation by 2050. The transformation case is something on the order of a 1.9 degree budget in 2050, while the breakthrough case does meet a 1.75°C proportional carbon budget. Next slide. Here we are presenting both the absolute results over time, that is the left graphic, and then the cumulative results over time for the scenarios. So the solid lines in each case are the central traffic forecast for that scenario, and the uncertainty margin is a variation of passenger traffic growth rates between I believe it's 2.7 and 3.7% per year. So you can see substantial reductions across the scenarios. In the action case, we're in essence capping 2050 emissions at below 2019 levels. In transformation case, we're cutting them about in half. And in the breakthrough case, we're cutting them down to about 70 million tons per year. It's about a 94% decrease. There will always be some residual fuel use and residual carbon dioxide emissions from fuel production. So you can never hit absolute zero, but we get pretty close. The right-hand side is showing, again, the cumulative results over time. And key thing to remember is that the breakthrough scenario is consistent with a 1.75°C temperature target. You will see that every scenario that we modeled breaks through the 1.5°C temperature threshold in 2030. And we'll return to that finding later in the presentation. Next slide. I'll close with two thoughts just to highlight some of the challenges. So our overall finding, I think, is pretty optimistic. We do think that aviation with significant action can be brought in line with the Paris Agreement, but we shouldn't underestimate the difficulties and the challenges associated with it. And one way to look at this is just to consider the volume of renewable energy that will be needed to meet the breakthrough case. So what we're showing here are the total jet fuel use in a given year in exajoules. That is the black line, and then the total energy use taking into account energy needed for fuel production as the stacked bars. So you can see we're starting with, in essence, 0 exajoules of renewable electricity used in aviation in 2020. And we're ramping that up to 25 exajoules in 2050 in order to produce the e-fuels and potentially the renewable hydrogen that we need to zero out fossil fuel jet use. It's a huge increase. Of that 25, 12.5 exajoules is just lost in the energy conversion process. And to put kind of that 25 exajoules into perspective, in 2019, total global renewable power production was about 29 exajoules. That's all the production of hydro, geothermal, wind, and solar in that year. So in essence, our core findings are that in order to hit net zero for aviation, we need to build an entirely new renewable energy grid in 2050 just to produce synthetic aviation fuels. Next slide. Oh, if you could skip back, thank you. I did want to highlight that along with other roadmaps, we're using a relatively narrow set of traffic assumptions. Again, between once we take into account the demand response between 2.2 and 3.7% of traffic growth per year. But it's quite possible that traffic can grow considerably faster than that. There's a small chance it might grow slower than that, but I wouldn't bet on it. And in follow-on work from the main study, I've looked at, what happens if traffic growth is very different from what we model in the study. And unfortunately, what you can see is there's entirely the potential that if we return to pre-COVID traffic growth rates, even the kind of heroic level of clean technology development that we've modeled in this study can get overwhelmed. Prior to COVID, global passenger traffic was increasing by about 7% per year. If we were to return to that figure through 2050, even if we model out all of the technology breakthroughs I've highlighted in the breakthrough case, the resulting CO2 emissions could actually be higher than our base case with minimum technology and 3% traffic growth per year. So let's not ignore the potential for traffic growth of complicating the climate goals that I've highlighted today. Next slide. Actually, go forward too. Yes, so I hope you've enjoyed the presentation and my outline of the study. Our key findings are that we do feel we can align aviation with a below 2 degrees Celsius aspiration under the Paris Agreement, but it is going to require significant near-term ambition and investment. I highlighted that we think that a 1.75 degrees Celsius future is achievable in assuming a 67% chance of success and that aviation doesn't increase its share of a global carbon budget. We were not able to model through in-sector technology and baseline traffic growth rates. We were not able to model a 1.5 degree future for aviation. So if policymakers wish to hit that, we expect some combination of direct atmospheric removals of carbon dioxide and or significant curbs to traffic growth would be needed. We do find that CO2 emissions from aviation will need to peak at the latest by 2030 and as soon as 2050 to put aviation on this 1.75 degree pathway. And then finally, to minimize the risk of overshoot of the temperature targets, we do recommend that whatever long-term goal is agreed to at ICAO this fall, that it be set on a cumulative target rather than a single year, for example, 0 in 2050 year basis. So that is my presentation today. Next slide. Just wanted to thank the extended team that worked on this this project and Zoe as well for facilitating the webinar and open it up to questions and discussion.
Great, thank you, Dan, so much for that wonderful presentation. Excellent job. I think we have a couple minutes and maybe we can get to about 2-3 questions. As a reminder, please submit your questions in the control panel under the questions block. And if we don't get to your question today, we'll try and get to you via email. You can email them to dan@theicct.org or to communications@theicct.org. All right, so Dan, summing up your presentation, the UN is aiming to set a 2050 climate target for aviation this fall. What is your key takeaway for policymakers from this report?
Yes, so The key takeaway really is that we think that a near zero emission future in 2050 is possible for aviation, but that we will need significant and aggressive action in the near term. ICAO is a little bit of a tricky beast. It is working to set an aspirational target, and fundamentally most of the policies that will be needed to meet that target are under the purview of national government. So ICAO itself can't be too directive about how that particular climate target is met, but we do think that there are better and worse ways to set it. And I've highlighted kind of the key one is we don't want to allow aviation emissions to continue to grow through 2040 and then try and cliff dive them to zero in 2050. So we definitely feel that a cumulative emissions target, and or a target with interim milestones, for example, in addition to net zero in 2050, having a 30% reduction under our belt in 2035 is going to be really important.
Great, thank you. I'm glad there is hope. A question here, was this analysis purely done for passenger airplanes? Have freight planes and other planes uses, example, firefighting planes, private jets considered?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have presented all the results here in the basis of passenger aircraft, which account for about 85% of CO2 emissions from aviation. We do also model the freight side of things. However, our data is a little bit fuzzier on dedicated freight in particular. So the answer is we do cover freight carriage. We do it mostly in the format of a multiplier on the core findings of passenger aircraft, but that extra 15% of CO2 that is associated with dedicated freight and belly freight is taken into account in all of the results that I've presented today.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions about sustainable aviation fuels. I'll try and just ask one of them since we have limited time. So this question is, the numbers are overwhelming but not impossible. I see no alternative than massively entering the SAF era. Do you agree?
Sorry, could you repeat? I see no alternative, but
I see no alternative than massively entering the SAF era. Do you agree?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's a core finding of our work. The implied SAF introductions under the breakthrough case, it's about a 4,000-fold increase from 2020 production. So it's a huge increase, but it is about 60% of overall mitigation. One result that I did not present today is, we do see fuel efficiency as important to aligning the overall energy demand of the sector with the potential supply of clean fuels. And there is a difference between our results and other roadmaps in terms of the total energy demand. I believe the IATA Waypoint 2050 roadmap assumes 25 exajoules of fuel demand in 2050. Our breakthrough case is 16% of exajoules. So I think there is a little bit of disagreement on the total volume of SAF that we'll need, but all the roadmaps are pointing towards the goal of trying to zero out fossil fuel use in 2050, and that will require huge volumes of SAF.
Great. Kind of a follow-up to that, what is the most viable alternative jet fuel and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll need to caveat that it depends on the year. Like longest term, the research points towards e-kerosene, which is generated from like a wind or solar resource and carbon capture, has the potential to be the lowest life cycle emissions fuel. But e-kerosene remains quite expensive today, and it will take time to scale up all of the necessary technologies. So in the near term, say in 2030, we do see the cleanest biofuels generated either from like a waste like used cooking oil or a cellulosic resource as also being important. In our model, biofuels cap out at about 4 exajoules, so 100 million tons total, and longer term e-fuels dominate. So I focus on those two buckets of fuel and those two different timeframes.
Thank you. I think we have time for only one more question. And we'll, once again, please keep sending your questions in. We will try to get back to you. They are important for us to keep doing our work. Dan, last question here. The report lays out 4 possible futures of aviation emissions from baseline to more ambitious scenarios. You, Dan Rutherford, which do you think is the most likely?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I mean, we develop these as scenarios, not predictions, and use them to explore the space of what is possible as a goal and what policies will be needed. But you're asking something more difficult, is which do I think is actually going to happen? That's a really tough one. I would say, I mean, we do see a lot of leadership from the EU right now, and green shoots of a revolution there in clean fuels and planes. But it's policies themselves are delayed in other jurisdictions, and especially at the international level. So it's hard to point to like a market which is on any of these trajectories. So I certainly hope that we're on the breakthrough case. I think we would know by 2030 whether or not we are, because we would need to see these new technologies delivered. But yeah, if I had to guess, I would say, boy, I guess I can't answer it. Sorry, I dodged that one.
No problem. I think we'll end it there today. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in today's presentation. Really appreciate your questions and your attendance. And don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions. Once again, you can email Dan at theicct.org or email communications@theicct.org. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon.
All right, thank you.
Bye.